mdsports.com for the second time in 2 years as we crank through these previews, previewing the Maryland Terrapins tonight. Mr. Jeff, thank you once again for making some time for us, sir. How are you doing tonight?
Absolutely, I'm good. I appreciate you having me on again, Ryan.
And thank you, everyone, for tuning in tonight. I think this is our eighth preview as we make our way through the Big Ten here. So, about halfway through these. Talking Maryland tonight, I think heading into the season, Jeff, we had the Big Ten media poll released today. And if my math is correct, they were 16th ahead of only Purdue and Northwestern. So, not a lot of faith in the Terrapins this year. And that's coming off of a tough 2024 season where it ended a run of three consecutive bowl games. A team that was pretty reliable, going 8 games a year, winning 8 games a year since the COVID shortened season, but fell off a cliff a little bit last year. 4 wins for the season, only one of them being in Big Ten play. They were in the hundreds in both scoring offense and scoring defense. Heading into this 2025 season, what's been kind of the tenor of the fan base with this team, and perhaps more importantly, with head coach Mike Locksley?
I think the fan base is, I would say, somewhere between frustrated and apathetic. Obviously, it's a one, what have you done for me lately kind of business. You know, the 3 years before that, like you said, 8 wins a year, won bowl games 3 years in a row for the first time in the program's history. Flip side, you know, those 3 seasons didn't include that one breakthrough marquee win that the fans have so desperately craved year after year that just hasn't materialized. So you know, you go 1-8, and the only win in the Big Ten was a last-second miracle, needing a blocked field goal to beat USC on homecoming. So very nearly a winless year. So I think you know everybody, whether it's Mike Locksley, the fans, the administration, they desperately want to see you know a bounce back season this year. The catch there being that, as you mentioned with the Big Ten poll, you know they're not expected to be one of the better teams in the conference.
Is it fair to classify him as being on the hot seat heading into the season?
You know, it's no one can say with certainty because there's a new AD.
Hmm.
He literally just started on the job, you know, a week ago. So no one outside of Jim Smith and his inner circle have any clue what you know, what his opinion on Mike Locksley was. If it was an AD we knew and we knew what their relationship was and things like that, it'd be easier to say yes, he's on the hot seat. That said, when you're coming off a year like last year and the stands are probably going to be pretty barren this fall unless they really get a hot streak going just based on you know the fan vibes and how last season went. I think any new AD is going to take a serious look at the situation. His whole you know his whole selling point, Jim Smith, their new AD, is his ability to raise revenue, and part of that obviously is ticket sales. And so, you know, that's a long answer to what could be a one word question, or what could be a one word answer to your question. But I would say Mike Locksley, it's a pivotal season for him, and he needs to, you know, show positive growth and improvement. And it sure wouldn't hurt to pull off one of those kind of big name wins that I mentioned.
In your kind of coverage of the team in the immediate postseason and rolling through spring practices this year, have you gotten a sense of what the introspection with the coaching staff has been on what kind of went wrong last year? Because it wasn't an awful start to the season, and the non-conference schedule was what it was. You kind of ended up being a pretty good team to start the year, and they handled them well. You have the early close loss to Michigan State. Even in that Indiana game at the end of September, they were going back and forth for most of the first half, but once you get into October, you have the close win against USC, but Northwestern's losses to end the year, it's not even like we're talking about, just a string of one-score losses where, we made some mistakes or the other team made one more play than we did. We're just talking about a string of games that weren't particularly close to end the season.
Yeah, it's a classic case of things getting bad and then snowballing out of control. You really have to look for introspection, I don't think, with the coaches, because Mike Locksley has outwardly said he thinks he lost the locker room for the first time in his career. A lot of that he's attributed to, funding, basically, that they had $3 million to go around on their roster. Other Big Ten programs had several multiples of that. So, only some guys could make real money. It's hard to spread that around among 80 or however many guys. Obviously, not the whole 80 aren't getting money, but to spread it around a lot of guys, so you're going to have jealousy issues and things like that. So that's what Locksley has come out and said. This year obviously they'll be funding it to the same point as most of the other Big Ten programs now, with $20 million that schools can directly pay athletes with. So that bridge should be mostly. Or that gap should be mostly bridged. We'll see how things go with the enforcement and the NIL and things like that. But yeah, that's the gist of it. He felt like last year it was just the locker room was lost and things just got out of control. And the other, actual tangible part of it is when you have poor play in the trenches in the Big Ten, it doesn't matter. You're not going to win. And offensive line was arguably the worst in the Big Ten. Defensive line wasn't great, and the secondary was very porous. So it was just all around, a nightmare year for Locksley and Maryland.
Mm-hmm. Now, offensively last year, there certainly were some bright spots on this team, namely Tai Felton, nearly 100 catches, 1,000 yards receiving. Kaden Prather, also a fantastic year catching the ball last year, but both of those guys are gone, as is the entire quarterback room, so they're reshaping the offense this year, and to do so, he's gone the NFL route with Pep Hamilton. He's been renowned for his QB development throughout his career. What style, what scheme do you envision the Terps running in 2025 with Pep Hamilton at the helm?
I mean, it's still going to be primarily Locksley's system. He's a strong believer in his offensive kind of multiple system. Likes to throw the ball around, throw to set up the run a little more, than most coaches do. Really likes to employ his tight ends. So I don't think that's going to change dramatically. I think with Pep, you probably will see them try to establish a power running game a little bit more than they have in the past. I mean, they've tried last year at times, but offensive line just wasn't good enough. So I think you might see a little more running than in previous years, but otherwise, I don't think Locksley's ever. He's not a guy who's going to ever just hire somebody to run a brand new system.
What do you expect at the running back position this year with Roman Hemby's departure to Indiana in the transfer portal?
I think Nolan Ray is the guy. We've been hearing about him now for 2 years since he arrived from Michigan, a guy they recruited, and a lot of other schools were on coming out of Detroit, and then he broke his leg. Some other schools backed off. Really fast, explosive running back, has a little bit of that kind of Barry Sanders, not to say he's comparable, but stylistically really good, low balance, can break tackles. He showed it last year. I was surprised he didn't get more carries. I think with Hemby gone, that clears the way. Hemby had a really good career, but his big plays kind of tailed off in the final 2 years of his career at Maryland, so they feel like maybe Ray has a little bit fresher legs. So he's a guy, if you asked me to name a few players who most people don't know about who could become stars this year, he'd be one of the first guys I'd mention.
Now, how about out wide? Obviously, we touched on the departures of Felton and Prather. Any names jumping out that we should be knowing heading into 2025?
Well, Octavian Smith is the only established returning guy. He's been Maryland's third receiver. Was a 4-star a few years ago. Really slippery runner, but really hasn't been able to turn that into consistent success. Last year, he was a little more consistent, especially down the stretch, but they're saying that they feel like he's ready to be that kind of number 1 or number 2 guy this year. Talent is clearly there, but it's you need to see it first. Jaleel Farouk is a transfer from Oklahoma, a very highly regarded guy. Came home. He had gone to Oklahoma with his buddy Caleb Williams, who obviously left for USC a couple years ago, and now he's coming back home maybe to finish his career up. If he's healthy, which he missed pretty much all of spring ball, as I understand it, he should give them a dynamic kind of guy. But neither one of them has proven to be the caliber necessarily of a Tai Felton and some of the guys Maryland's had in recent years. So I would say that receiving core is one of the bigger questions.
And getting the guy the ball, quarterback battle heading into the season, it sounds like that's between UCLA transfer Justyn Martin, who we all got a pretty good look at when he started for the Bruins against Penn State last year, as well as 4-star true freshman Malik Washington, who I looked this up before the show, is the 3rd highest ranked quarterback commit in the internet recruiting era for Maryland, behind Chris Kelly in the 2000 class and Jeremy Ricker in the 2006 class. A little funny trivia for us there. But
I'm old enough to have been covering Maryland when both those guys went there.
I will not tell you what I was doing in the year 2000. I think I was in fourth grade. But is this going to be something that you expect to be handled pretty quickly in camp, or how do you envision this battle playing out?
Loxley's generally secretive, and then when you add in that, he has so much on the line with Malik Washington, who, is the future of the program, essentially. So I don't think he's going to really reveal a plan. It'll probably be one of those things where we find out the plan on the day of the game. Which has happened before, and is especially likely given this situation. I wouldn't be surprised if he, even if he's decided that Washington is the guy, which is a very real possibility, that maybe Justyn Martin starts those first 2 or so games just so Washington can come in with a little less pressure on him, a little less hype, or he could just start him right out of the gate. I mean, everything you hear out of Maryland is that he's the truth. He's as good as, all of the accolades and recruiting rankings and everything else, both physically and in terms of the intangibles. He's a natural leader. He's just like you illustrated with those rankings. Maryland doesn't get these caliber quarterback prospects very often. So if there's one thing right now generating hope for the program, he's the biggest thing.
The player management aspect of college football in 2025 is so fascinating to me, because in past years you think, right, this guy's clearly better, or maybe he's a little bit better, but we're going to give the edge to the experience because he's been there before. And not to say that Justyn Martin is superiorly more experienced than Malik Washington in this instance, but in this age of unfettered player movement, you have a player with the recruiting profile of Malik Washington, and for a program like Maryland, who traditionally has been in that period of, not the program that's poaching players from other power schools, but the one where, hey, I want to go and have an opportunity to win a national title. Do you get the sense that there's any consideration to, hey, we think this guy's the future, we want to, maybe even if it's a tie, we give the advantage to the young guy to keep him around and see if we can build something with him?
No, I don't think so. First of all, because I think he might just be the better quarterback right now, so I'm not sure it would even require that kind of, manipulation to get him onto the field. And the other thing is that I think he really trusts Mike Locksley. He wouldn't have gone to Maryland otherwise. He could have gone most schools in the country if he wanted to, but he's all in on the plan. He's not one of these players who's just all about attention and NIL and these things, very kind of old soul to him. So in some instances, yes, but in this one, I would say no, that's probably not a thing.
Do you get a sense of what his strengths are? I mean, we're talking both of these guys. They're both big dudes, listed 6'4", 215, 220 pounds. What do each of these guys bring to what could be the Maryland offense in 2025?
I would say Washington has a bit stronger arm. Martin doesn't have a bad arm. They're saying that he's been throwing really well lately. He struggled a little bit in the spring game. I think Washington's a little more athletic too. He was a really good basketball player in high school. Probably could have played Division I easily. So obviously Martin brings a little more experience to the table. Like you said, he started against Penn State and didn't play poorly on the road in a really tough spot. Other than that, he doesn't have a ton of experience. So they're not entirely different guys, similar size-wise, like you said. I just think with Washington, there's a little bit more of that kind of dynamic star quality.
Gotcha. And for our listeners who don't know, Malik Washington from Severn, Maryland, I believe is how you pronounce it. Just a stone's throw away from the College Park campus, about a 30-minute drive there. So local kid would be really. I love the story like that. The local kid comes, quarterbacks the team. It'd be a fun story to watch this year. But you touched on earlier the offensive line, and this was really a struggle for this team in 2024. It sounds like only 2 returning starters back this year from a line that averaged 2.5 sacks almost per game allowed last year, and only 3.6 yards per carry on the season for the Terps. What is the expectation for the unit in 2025 that will be protecting a new quarterback?
Locksley let his offensive line coach Brian Braswell go after about a month in the last season, so they've got a new pecking order there at that position. They feel like they'll be a little better coached and developed. A lot of it is the same guys who are on that same line that struggled last year, so that development really needs to occur. They did bring in some reinforcements, the biggest one being a kid named Rotrell Perry from Central Connecticut State, had offers from Ohio State and a bunch of other heavy hitters. He should be one of the better guys. And then another big addition is Isaiah Wright. He was a transfer from Buffalo last year, got injured and didn't play at all. And they feel like he's one of their best, if not their best, offensive linemen. So the talk is that it's improved, but you never know until the bullets start flying.
Mm-hmm. On the defensive side of the ball, this was a unit that finished last in the Big Ten in 2024 with only 14 sacks on the season, while as a whole, they were near the bottom of the conference, allowing 30.5 points per game and nearly 380 yards per game. A new defensive coordinator in town, Ted Monachino. He was a defensive line coach, for North Carolina last year, was a defensive analyst the year prior. And he's another guy who brings a ton of NFL experience, particularly with his prowess coaching pass rushing. What can we expect from the scheme for the Terps in 2025? Any notable changes?
I think it'll be more aggressive than it was under Brian Williams, especially last year. They were very conservative. That might have led to that low sack number that you mentioned. I mean, it wasn't all his fault. Personnel was somewhat underwhelming, but they did have 2 D tackles who were both drafted, and a safety who was drafted. So it's not like there was no talent there. Mm-hmm. But I do think they'll be more aggressive. Like you said, Monachino is a pass rushing guy. He's worked with Terrell Suggs and some other really heavy hitter kind of pass rushers. So. And they'll have better defensive backs this year than they had last year. It's hard to be really aggressive when your DBs are getting, fried regularly. So I think that'll be the difference. And I think, even though they lost a few guys to the NFL and a few in the portal, I think there's a chance that there's more talent overall on this defense.
Yeah, the age-old question is is the pass defense getting fried because there's no pass rush, or are they getting fried because the cornerbacks just can't cover anyone? Not the kind of argument you want to be in there. How do you envision kind of that front seven lining up? Is he going to be more a 3-4 guy, more a 4-3, or kind of a mix of both?
I think it'll be a mix, but it's really hard to say because he hasn't been a college coordinator before. He worked most of his career in the NFL, decades worth. Like you mentioned, defensive line coach at UNC last year, but there's not really a body of work for us to know exactly how he'll line up. With camp starting soon, I'm sure we'll get some interviews and hear a little bit more about his plans. But he's kind of a wild card at this point.
Gotcha. Any underclassmen that you either any level of the defense that you're kind of eyeing, that you're excited to get eyes on in fall camp to see kind of where they're stacking up on the depth chart here?
Yeah, Daniel Wingate is a linebacker, 6'4", 230. He's one of the lower rated among the recruits. As we know, it's not necessarily science with the ratings, and he's one of those guys. Most of those guys Maryland sent to the NFL in recent years have been that kind of mid or high 3-star player, almost all of them, and he could be the next one. Big, physical, super aggressive. I think he's got a chance to be a big time player. In secondary, they're not necessarily young guys, but there's new guys. Dante Joyner, transfer from Arkansas State at corner, should be a big upgrade. And then, Jalen Husky, also not necessarily a young guy, but I think, after last year, he came over from Bowling Green, had been an all-MAC cornerback, and really struggled early on. Made the switch to safety last year, and now, from what I hear, he could be the best player on their defense.
Go Falcons. That's all I'll say about that one. I want to kind of wrap up the discussion here, just kind of talking schedule, big picture for the season. It's not certainly a manageable non-conference schedule with Florida Atlantic, Northern Illinois, and Towson, and really not a bad Big Ten draw either. You're not getting Penn State, you're not getting Ohio State, you're not getting Oregon. You have Indiana, Illinois, and Michigan as likely preseason ranked teams, but all of those games come in November, so certainly a backloaded schedule for Maryland here. As you kind of look at the schedule as a whole and what this team is bringing back for 2025, what would you say constitutes a successful season for Maryland this year? Is it more a win total, or given kind of the youth and turnover on the roster, is it more a, hey, let's look like we're making progress this year, be better towards the end of the season than we were at the beginning, and feel good about where we're heading into 2026?
Yeah, Ryan, my guess is that's like a sliding scale. Like, we've seen Maryland often start hot with these soft non conference schedules and then really struggle later as the schedule's backloaded, as you mentioned. This is the easiest, or I shouldn't say easiest, but this is the lightest schedule they've had in quite a while. Mike Locksley for years talked about how once, realignment and the divisions were done away with, it would be a huge advantage for Maryland, or a huge boost in their prospects, because you're not playing those teams that you mentioned every year. And so this is the first time they're avoiding as many of those top teams as they are. On one hand, you might want that during a year when you feel like you have a chance to do some big things, kind of like Indiana feasted on that pretty soft schedule last year. On the other, though, if you're in the make or break season, it's not too bad to have that. So I think if you had that hot start where you were 4-0 or 4-1 or whatever, and then you tail off and you end up with 5 wins, that's not the same as if you win 5 or 6, but as you said, you get better in the year. You beat some good teams, and Malik Washington looks like the future, and a lot of these other young guys look ready to really become stars down the road. But you know, in a nutshell, I would say if I were Mike Locksley, I'd want to get to at least 6 wins.
Yeah, get back to that bowl game. That certainly would be something to hang your hat on. And it's just looking at some of these teams too, like predicting. I'd say once you get outside like the top 7 of the Big Ten, it's so hard to kind of figure out what a schedule should be, because you're not only counting on so many things to break right for your team, but also, you know, who knows what Wisconsin is going to be this year. And Nebraska certainly has a lot of hype around them, but it's not like they've done anything that warrants that. UCLA has a new quarterback. Could they be better? Certainly, but again, there's not exactly a lot of confidence in them. So we're looking at these things, a lot of these teams, and there's so many things that can break certain ways. Like even with Indiana's schedule last year, I still don't think anyone anticipated that they would go 11-1. So it's certainly going to be fascinating to kind of see how the schedule breaks here for Maryland.
Yeah, I mean, and even if they start 3-0, people aren't necessarily going to be fully bought in, because again, that's been a trend, having those 3-0, 4-0, 4-1 kind of starts, and then things falling apart later on once you start playing the Ohio States of the world, and even like you said last year, Northwestern. So I think for Locksley, though, it's advantageous to have this schedule this year and kind of a survival mode kind of season. Fans will understandably complain about that soft beginning with FAU and Towson and such, but for Maryland, as they've been trying to climb uphill in this really difficult situation in the Big Ten against all these proven programs with far more resources and fan support and things like that, the Big Ten schedule is tough enough by itself. You got to find some other wins, and they do have some other series coming up with better teams, but at this point, I would say you save that for when the ship has been steadied.
Is there, looking at the schedule, kind of like a break point where you say, like, hey, this could be a big swing game to determine the type of season that Maryland has? Because, if they are able to get through this non-conference schedule at 3-0, and then you're at Camp Randall, which, again, who knows what Wisconsin is going to be, that's certainly a tough place to play. But you sneak a win at Wisconsin heading into a bye week, and then you're heading into October at 4-0, and not saying that, oh boy, Maryland's going to be primed to make a run here, but you certainly would have to feel good about sitting there looking at the rest of that schedule then saying, hey man, we just got to win 2 of these last 8s and we're going to get to a bowl game here.
Yeah, there's a bunch of 50-50 games, I would say, on the roster, or at least that look like 50-50 at the moment. A month from now, they might look totally, or excuse me, 2 months from now, they might look totally different. But, the Rutgers game, I think, that's typically a coin flip. Nebraska at home, most of the games, if they are as good as they believe they are, which inside the building at Maryland, they're not believing any of this, 16th in the Big Ten kind of talk. They think that they're just, young talent that people don't know about yet for the most part. Um, you know, I think those are games that are winnable for the most part because, again, you don't have Penn State, you don't have Oregon, and you don't have Ohio State. So, this is arguably the most important year that the program's had in recent memory.
Mhm. Well, I'm sure, Jeff, it will not be a boring year devoid of storylines for you to cover here. Refresh our listeners' memory before we get you out of here for the day. Where can everyone find your work, and what are you working on here over these next couple weeks prior to fall camp starting at the end of the month?
Yeah, the site is InsideMDSports.com. We're on the 24/7 Sports Network. Same stuff as always. Ton of recruiting coverage, football and basketball scoop that you generally won't find anywhere else, and lots more football coverage as we get into camp season.
Well, we're looking forward to keeping tabs on this team as the season heads along here, Jeff. Thank you once again for making some time for us, me, singular. Clinton's chirping in the comments somewhere right now. He can't just stay away. But thank you again, sir, for joining us tonight. We really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Everyone, thank you for joining us as we go through our fall preview series. We'll be live again tonight on YouTube at 9 Eastern talking the Indiana Hoosiers. These will be up in your feed at some point this week. I haven't figured that out, how we're going to sequence it, but they'll all be there. Thank you once again for joining us, and we will see you guys later tonight for Indiana.